hear their voice.
OK， 好啊，你有听到吼？所以拖到即摆吼才办这个演讲会啦吼。会呢，主要就是我哋个会友呢来写文章、办演讲啦吼。啊，大家吼文章发表伫迄个媒体来影响着即个社会。笔会每年出版台美文集甲年刊吼。咱办即个演讲呢，也是写文章呢，包括的范围呢是即个逐项拢有啦吼，政治、医学、科学吼，这拢有。当礼拜吼，我有发一个笔会的要求，大家吼，你有文章吼来投稿，咱准备2002年的迄个刊物吼，内容呢就是讲你家己写创作吼，大概以1000字到3000字为主啦吼，你后要放相片会。大概放3张、4张安尼吼，任何你文章写好吼，你得当投稿来叫这个笔会吼，笔会有这个编辑小组吼，编辑小组会来你来你看有更改了，最后要印出前啊，会向互你做最后的确认啦吼。是最近的认可是迄个非盈利吼。机关吼，你也donation 会当tax deductible 吼，会当扣税。欢迎大家有兴趣来参加这个研究会员吼。笔会接受这个支票donation 啦吼。笔会有笔会mailbox 吼，有迄个 email address。当2020年旧年吼，2月了开始呢。就因为 COVID-19 吼，就拢关起来，了咱就改做网络的演讲吼。咱一路上呢，拢办有这个这个 asset 资产传承哦，这种规划吼，都有请这个2位哈佛医生吼，何全义甲施雅婷医生吼，来讲这 COVID-19 post 的 experience 吼。然后咱咱李登辉金融吼过身吼，咱请这李丰奇教授甲胡忠信先生来讲这个前总统的台湾意识甲民主价值。然后呢，因为即摆 AI 时代吼，所以由我吼甲2位吼魏宇峰甲林清荣这伫公司开公司用 AI 的产品吼，来讲这个 AI 的发展甲应用吼。然后呢。关心这个食品的营养呢，咱请迄个社企甲黄庆安和黄冠勋3位来讲这个食品营养、健康甲安全。因为这个今年吼，2月7日这年话呢，因为是 COVID-19， 所以咱取消了吼，无感觉讲无面对面吼，大家见面安尼庆祝吼，无迄个气氛啦，大家办这个演讲吼。咱 proposal 就已经有逐个月拢有办这演讲啊吼，即摆来2月吼，今仔日就这个演讲吼，今仔日呢8点讲了先吼，啰嗦吼，先请咱讲这个台美的关系吼，了呢8点50呢为迄个蔡明芳吼，伊要讲这个美国世纪的大选吼。然后黄青炎律师伊要讲台美关系，伊个人吼认为讲台美应该安怎做吼。最后9点50有这个 Q&A。咱演讲时阵吼，请大家吼 mute 你的麦克吼。你吼有啥物问题吼，你会当写伫用你的 chat box 吼，你会当写伫你的问题写伫 chat box 内底吼。你最后吼他只会甲你回答吼。咱迄位吼，我可能先吼3位演讲者吼，我先大概介绍一下啦吼。安尼毋免讲教训都换吼，我来介绍安尼吼。第一个演讲者是阮所肖吼，伊吼即摆伫 DC 啦吼，伊Bachelor 吼是伫迄个国际关系伫 American University 啦吼。 伊是律师吼，律师是伫迄个Catholic University of America 吼，因为伊即摆是迄个 GTI 吼 Global Taiwan Institute Executive Director，因仔是 Senior Fellow 伫 Jamestown Foundation 伊以前呢伫Penn Campbell Fellow 伫National Endowment for Democracy 都是迄个访问的学者伫日本东京大学伫遐访问，伊Senior Research Fellow 伫这个 Project 2049 Institute， 甲这个国家安全National Security Fellow 伊过去是一个伫 China Brief at Jamestown Foundation 伊是一个editor 对。演讲了呢，咱就换蔡明芳先生要演讲伊是台电甲台化公司的化工师啦台湾汉尼威尔的工程师伊即摆大家拢知影伊的台湾 US 单位台湾海外已经创办20几年真无简单啦每日拢来看有20万人遐济啦伊捌伫即个台湾遮几间大学明治联合勤益逢甲做讲师甲副教授即蔡先生呢，伊的经历真丰富啦伊做过纽约纽约市的东洋会会长会馆的理事长笔会伊做要做前会长美党的民进党的主委平洲。叫做个侨务委员全侨的自由和平联盟的干事长伊45年拢伫海外推动这个民主运动这个青年律师伊出世伫这宜兰台湾伫巴厘岛毕业来 UCLA 读 Master。伊是这个 SUNY Binghamton Research Associate 伊即摆是这个公司 President 是管 China Resources and Environment Incorporation 伊有2个patent US patent 是 Principal Investigator for 2 SBIR 这是学术界甲公司的 grant 这个 Phase 1甲 Phase 2sponsored by U.S. Federal Agent 个 Department of Transportation 加Air Force 啦伊是Community Service 伊做发拍Chapter President 2年伊是GTI 的 Co-founder 伊本身是伊是伫 New York City 是the member of 这个Innovator Group， 即摆是笔会内底理事好，咱请这个来甲咱演讲我现在先答询。现在多少？我现在 make you presenter 了
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Shi. Can all of you hear me? Okay.
Okay. 有真清楚。
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, I have a young toddler at home, and so if I am speaking very softly, it's not because I'm trying to tell you all very, very secretive things. It's only because I'm trying to keep my son from, not waking up. So please bear with me as I am making my way through my presentation. And first of all, I want to thank Dr. Shi and Jane and my co-panelists Jane and Martin for participating in today's event. It's truly an honor for me to be able to engage all of you in a conversation, I hope, about a topic that I'm obviously very much invested in terms of my professional experience. Dr. Shi has already gone over my CV. As you may have already noticed, much of my professional life has been focused in the field of Taiwan policy studies. What that means is that I've engaged a lot in my professional career in talking and writing and pontificating about Taiwan here in the United States, and I certainly enjoy that. But it's really refreshing to sometimes be able to now talk outside of Washington D.C. because it can be quite a bubble sometimes when we just talk amongst ourselves, and I'm really here to listen to all of you as much as it is for me to also engage you in terms of what I've been assigned to talk about, which is U.S. Taiwan relations. U.S. Taiwan relations obviously is a very broad topic, and so there's clearly not enough time for me to go in too much details about the history. Clearly, the history of which many of you have lived through, and so there will be no point for me to discuss that at any length. But really, I think what my focus will be today will be more in terms of contemporary U.S.-Taiwan relations, and hopefully, given that the focus is on the election and what the future will be, I will focus on in terms of what got us here and where I think things will be going in the years to come. Um, I think it's only fair to say that what I'm here to tell you is not what I think U.S.-Taiwan relations should be. I'm here to tell you what I think and what my assessments of what U.S.-Taiwan relations is. And there's a big difference. I think that for many of us who are engaged in Taiwan policy, many of times we think of what it should be, much less about what it is. And I hope that perhaps some of my discussion here will lay out a lot of the facts, a lot of the developments that have happened, at the very least in the last 4 years, so that we have a foundation on which all of us can really go forward in talking about where we think the relationship will go in the 4 years to come. So laying that out as the basis of my discussion or my conversation with all of you here today, I think the starting point for what we need to talk about really starts 4 years ago in December of 2016. Now, some of you may recall that at that point, President Donald Trump, or former President Donald Trump, hasn't been formally inaugurated yet. But yet on December 2nd, President-elect Trump received a phone call from President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan. Now, that phone call was widely referred to in the American mainstream press as a significant policy shift. The fact that two world leaders spoke on the phone for probably a little over 10 minutes, in any other circumstances, that would probably be, a standard press release that would have been, issued by the State Department. But obviously, in the case of Taiwan, it's a little bit different given the sensitivities of Taiwan's status. And during the brief phone call, President Tsai congratulated the president-elect on his election victory. They exchanged views about the economy and regional issues as reported. Now, it is true that no U.S. president or president-elect had reportedly had a phone call or face-to-face conversation with the leader of Taiwan since 1979. But yet, I think it's very important for us to all remember at this point that nothing in the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, which is the governing legal document that dictates both the content as well as conduct of relations between the United States and Taiwan, prohibit the president-elect from receiving a phone call from the democratically elected leader of Taiwan. Yet at the same time, the media and the pundits, they all sounded the alarm and They all claimed how the phone call represented a earth-shattering break in U.S. policy. But nothing in that act itself actually represents a break in policy per se. So I know that it might sound a little bit of a contradiction or confusion here at this point, but the fact of the matter is that there is nothing explicit in the United States so-called one China policy that prohibited the president-elect from taking a phone call from the president of Taiwan. That is a fact. It was a long-standing practice. That is a matter of conduct. It is not a matter of substance. And this was clearly reflected in the statements made by even former policymakers who have opposed the phone call. So, for instance, the former senior director for Asian affairs of the National Security Council under the Obama administration, Jeffrey Bader, he underscored the implicit and self-imposed nature of those restrictions by pointing out, and I quote here, there have been quiet, non-visible written communications between the top leaders of the United States and Taiwan. Note that there have been quiet and non-visible written communications. So they've talked, right? The presidents of Taiwan and the president of the United States have talked before, communicated before, okay? But it has always been understood that direct conversations would cross a line not worth challenging, end quote. So the concern is not that the two top leaders have communicated, but how they communicated, right? So this is hardly a dispute over substance. So after news about President Tsai and President-elect Trump talk, the White House correctly noted that there was no change in policy because, in fact, there had not been any change in the U.S. policy towards Taiwan and China. It is still, because of law, unofficial relations between the United States and Taiwan. Nonetheless, the PRC has constantly and incessantly tried to reframe the debate and rejigger what is, the interpretation of those actions taken by the government. Beijing's leaders took the opportunity to try to draw a line around the United States one China policy and asserted that, and I quote, the one China policy is the cornerstone of the sound development of China-U.S. relations, and we don't want this political basis to be interfered with or damaged in any way, end quote. Now, that is not a statement of U.S. policy. That is a statement of PRC policy, and that is a statement of PRC's positions. The clearest articulation of the U.S. policy on of the one China policy was actually, in fact, issued only back in 2004. Now, that's some time ago. This was 17 years ago. And this was issued by the Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, James Kelly. He said, I can tell you what it is not. It is not the one China policy or the one China principle that Beijing suggests. And it may not be the definition that some would have in Taiwan. But it does convey a meaning of solidarity of a kind among the people of both sides of the strait. That has been our policy for a very long time. So this forms the underlying basis on which the United States has positioned itself in quite a strategically ambiguous position with regards to Taiwan's status that has sort of rebalanced the Taiwan Strait and relations between the Taiwan Strait for the many years in the past 40 years. I will skip over the history because I think all of us are quite familiar with that, but only to point out how controversial that the decision for the United States to switch diplomatic ties to the People's Republic of China was for the United States. Let's not forget that when President Carter, Jimmy Carter, decided unilaterally to sever ties with Taiwan, it was severely challenged by the U.S. Congress. Senator Barry Goldwater, along with 6 members of the Senate and 8 members of the House of Representatives, filed a complaint in the federal court challenging the constitutional authority of the president to terminate the Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and Taiwan. This was done primarily without the consent of the legislative branch, and that's why they were so pissed off. This, in a rapid chain of events, this was actually propelled up to the Supreme Court of the U.S. Although the Supreme Court ultimately did not decide on the merit of the case, because basically it decided this was not a legal issue, right? This was a political one, right? The exact phrasing of the Supreme Court at the time was that this was a non-justiciable political question. Right, it's a non-legal question. For those of us who study law, and I imagine that many of us probably on this call here are have some familiarity with the law, because I suppose that's just a Taiwanese thing to do. You're either a medical doctor or a lawyer. But nonetheless, I think that is a key question for a lot of the lawyers here, because at the end of the day, that leaves us to be open to a wide room of interpretation in terms of what is and what can be, right? And so, in that spirit, I think that, the U.S. Taiwan policy towards Taiwan since 1979 has, for better or for worse, have remained relatively consistent on this fundamental principle, as on the basis of the Taiwan Relations Act, and as the 3 communiques and the 6 assurances, and that basically, to this day, the United States has maintained that it only acknowledged the Chinese position that Taiwan is a part of China, but never recognized it, never accepted it. And that is a key distinction that I think for many of us who have to be very mindful of the wording and the phraseology of U.S. policy must understand. Leaving open, therefore, the question of Taiwan's status, and that ambiguity continues to this day in terms of the undetermined status of Taiwan. As far as the degree to which the United States is willing to go and defend Taiwan, there's also been a degree of ambiguity in U.S. position. For a very long time, even during the time when the United States had a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan, it was not without condition. There were conditions upon which the United States would actually intervene to defend Taiwan in the event of an invasion from the Chinese communists. And even after the abrogation of the mutual defense treaty, the United States has not forgone or has not completely forsaken or said that it would never come to the defense of Taiwan. In fact, it has left that quite ambiguous in terms of whether or not indeed it would intervene to defend Taiwan in the event of an attack by the People's Republic of China. But yet, there are demonstrations of what U.S. positions have been despite this ambiguity, right? I think one of the clearest indication of what U.S. positions have been are indicated in statements and actions taken by former presidents when there have been an escalatory situation in the Taiwan Strait. First and foremost, I think, when we have in more recent memory, I'm talking about, is when George W. Bush, who stated that, that if Taiwan came under attack from China, the United States would do, quote, whatever it took to help Taiwan defend itself. Right. And following that, well, before that, President Clinton, a Democrat, had sent in two air carrier strike groups in the vicinity of the Taiwan Strait during the 1995 and 1996 Taiwan the Missile Strait crisis. President Obama, more recently, have successively notified a significant tranche of arms sales to Taiwan. I mean, all these actions have been justified on current policy. And I think really, what we've seen in the case of the last 4 years have been really an expanding foundation on which those policies have been pursued. As much as we thought that maybe that there had been a significant change, as far as the elements of policy, as someone who have studied this, quite closely, and then especially in the last 4 years in my current capacity as the director of the Global Taiwan Institute, is that, the fundamental elements of policy have not changed. The interpretation of them have been expanded. And those interpretations are critical because they provide really the broader parameters on which the United States can continue to pursue our relations with Taiwan. So, I think it's worth taking a step back here and looking a bit again on really the extent to which the one China policy has, really plagued or perhaps provided a buffer in relations between the United States, the PRC, and Taiwan. The you may recall again that during the past 4 years, at least when President Trump was first elected, it wasn't just a phone call that really stirred controversy. There was another statement that he had made with regards to the one China policy that really called into question to what extent that administration would be adhering to these long-standing policies. And I think for some, it got many excited. For some, it got many scared, right, about what would happen next, when there's this presidency. And he said, and I quote, "I don't know why we, the United States, have to be bound by a one China policy unless we make a deal with China having to do with other things, including trade." So that was, for many of us who on this call probably have followed the incidents and the reactions that came from it, there was a huge falling out from the policy community, the foreign policy community, especially among Democrats that were scared about, what this meant. But despite all of that, we have to accept the fact that one China policy is neither static nor anything that President-elect Trump said at that time actually indicated a shift in policy. There is a prevailing misconception in U.S. policy because, frankly speaking, no one really knows what the U.S. one China policy is, and that ambiguity leaves a lot of room for which there are a lot of interpretation and oftentimes in my own view, we leave that to the PRC. We leave that to the Beijing to interpret and define. And that is why it has led to this sort of series of self-imposed restrictions that we have seen develop over the course of the last 4 decades. And that's why you've seen, at least over time, and not just in the immediate past administration, but successive administrations now that are probably breathing a sigh of relief to say that, well, you know yeah, maybe we've been a little bit too accommodating to Beijing, because we had these expectations that Beijing would somehow liberalize, and therefore there would be some type of peace between Beijing and Taipei as a result of this broader liberalization. And I think that there's been a rude awakening here in Washington, D.C., certainly among Republicans, and more so among Democrats, about really to the extent to which that expectation has really been has resulted in any kind of meaningful result in adjusting Beijing's behaviors. So what has happened then as a result of these questioning of U.S. Dogma as it relates to China, the PRC in China, is that it was quite an unstable environment over the last 4 years. Now, I probably don't need to go into much details about really the degree to which there have been a great deal of uncertainty in U.S.-China relations, for sure. But with U.S.-Taiwan relations, there have been actually quite a few remarkable uh, developments. And I think, as an institution that focuses really on what is, you know, um, I think it's my responsibility to document those, and to convey those developments accurately, so that we can have a more informed discussion about really what those developments mean for U.S.-Taiwan relations. Recall at the outset of my call today, I'm not here to tell you what I think U.S.-Taiwan relations should be. I'm here to tell you what I think in my assessment of what U.S.-Taiwan relations is. And really, my objective assessment is that despite expectations and perhaps overstated concerns, there was no necessarily fundamental change in U.S. policy towards Taiwan. I mean, the fact of the matter is that 4 years of the Trump administration did not change the legal framework, nor the policies that form the basis of U.S. policy towards Taiwan, the fundamental policy towards Taiwan, which essentially still remains firmly rooted in the Taiwan Relations Act as well as the Six Assurances. Even the U.S. One China policy remains intact. Recall when I mentioned early on when President Trump, during that first month, had questioned the One China policy, and everyone was screaming about how, or at least the critics were screaming about how that would upend policy. And look, fast forward 4 years down the road, you know what? Still, the U.S. policy remains still there, that there is a U.S. One China policy. Although I would argue that interpretation of that has been stretched, and rightfully so, in my interpretation at least. There is certainly an elasticity, sort of a bandwidth that kind of stretches in and out about how U.S.-Taiwan relations can be pursued under those framework. And certainly, as President Ronald Reagan made clear in his 1982 memo, which was also recently declassified as under the Trump administration, the U.S. commitment to Taiwan's self-defense is, quote, conditioned absolutely upon the continued commitment of China to the peaceful solution of the Taiwan PRC differences. Now, as China's actions have grown increasingly aggressive vis-a-vis Taiwan and the world, I think the United States has had to take a very hard look about updating its policies and practices to better reflect this objective reality. Now, this is not an argument to say that the U.S. adjustments policy towards Taiwan was conditioned entirely on China. I think that there is a intrinsic evaluation about how important Taiwan is, particularly in the context of Taiwan's democratic achievements and the geopolitical consideration of Taiwan's democracy in East Asia or in the Indo-Pacific, against the rise of an authoritarian streak in the broader region. But it would be ignorant to say that it had not, that reevaluation of China was not a factor in the overall consideration of how the U.S. approached of Taiwan. Justifying these adjustments in approach, I think clearly this was clearly articulated in U.S. policy statements by the most recent Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, David Stilwell, and he noted in a major policy speech. This is probably the most recent major Taiwan policy speech given by a U.S. Most senior U.S. official, and this was given in August in 2020, entirely focused on Taiwan policy. And I'll quote here: "What we are doing is making some important updates to our engagement with Taiwan to better reflect these policy and respond to changing circumstances. The adjustments are significant, but still within the boundaries of our One China policy. We feel compelled to make these adjustments for two reasons. First, because of the increasing threat posed by Beijing to peace and stability in the region, which is a vital interest of the United States. The second reason we have been focusing on our engagement with Taiwan is simply to reflect the growing and deepening ties of friendship, trade, and productivity between the United States and Taiwan." So that those two prongs that was highlighted by Stilwell's statements really do reflect two key fundamental pillars on which we have seen the adjustment in U.S. policy towards Taiwan over the most recent years, and why I think what sort of situates U.S.-Taiwan relations for how it's been positioned thus far, and the reason why I went at length in describing in great details all of these history or more recent history, of course, is because it is important to understand or take stock of what has happened to get an understanding for where we will go in the future. Now, understand that the purpose of my talk and the framing of the talk has been about what the elections mean for the future of U.S.-Taiwan relations, and I will certainly get to that. But I do want to emphasize that all of this background here, in terms of what happened in the last 4 years, I want to emphasize is not an anomaly. It's not something that just sort of happened by chance. It's not only because of Trump that these developments have happened. These fundamental changes have been something that has been a long overdue course correction by many foreign policy experts, both in Democratic and Republican camps, that have been calling for these changes because, frankly speaking, as I've mentioned earlier, there has been a misguided expectation by many here in the United States about really where the future of U.S.-China relations will lead. And I think what is also very instructive about just how views of Taiwan are changing here in the U.S. Can also be highlighted by, and here is a shameless self-promotion for GTI, and in just September, we hosted our annual symposium, and there we had Director Brent Christensen, who is the de facto U.S. ambassador to Taiwan, give one of the keynotes, and there he said, and I quote, "I believe the U.S.-Taiwan partnership underwent a subtle but powerful shift this year. This is the first time in my memory that influential voices began to discuss the U.S.-Taiwan partnership, excuse me, more on its own merits than solely in the U.S.-China context." And that is key. And that is absolutely key because for much of my discussion, even just now in the past 30 minutes or so, much of that has been couched in the context of U.S.-China policy, and that's just historic fact, and that's just historical fact in terms of how U.S. policy towards Taiwan has been framed. And one of the things that we've always advocated for in a general philosophical manner is that we should not be treating Taiwan policy as a subset of China policy, and we need to treat Taiwan in its own right. And the way that we do that in terms of our work, at least at GTI, has been always to focus on all these different various elements in which the United States has a very robust relationship with Taiwan. But nonetheless, we continue to address these issues that obviously have a lot of relevance. So going forward now, let's move forward and let's talk about really what are some of these where do we go from here, right? Where do we go from what are the improvements of the last several years, and how do we evaluate the current trajectory of U.S.-Taiwan relations under the new Biden administration? So I think in order to give us a good benchmark, let me just lay out here a few developments that I think are noteworthy in the last several years that I think we can use to evaluate, at the very least, the near-term developments, and then hopefully over time we can see to what extent the Biden administration can really live up to some of the improvements in U.S.-Taiwan ties. So I think one of the things that I highlighted already very much at the outset was that there was a phone call, right? A phone call between the president-elect and Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen. Now, clearly under the Biden administration, that hasn't happened yet, or that hadn't happened at least in the first term. But I'm going to go down the list here. There's been the regularization of arms sales between the United States and Taiwan, and that is a significant development for many people who perhaps are not as familiar with the arms sales process with Taiwan. That has been a very long-standing bone of contention because there's been a long-standing practice in the United States to bundle, if you will. I mean, bundle these arms sales packages because every time that there are an arms sales to Taiwan, Beijing will scream and yell and cause an uproar. And so there was a practice in the United States for a very long period of time since the 2000s to try to package as many of these arms sales together so that you can sort of just have it all in one big, sort of bundle so that, Beijing can just complain once as opposed to complaining so many various times. But that has left a very, essentially that has actually jeopardized Taiwan's security because that left it open to Beijing's consideration of when they want to, scream and yell about Taiwan arms sales, and when Taiwan gets its arms, right? When Taiwan gets what it needs and for its defense, and so there's been a regularization of these arms sales under the Trump administration, which means that whenever there's a notification made for a request from Taiwan, the U.S. side will then evaluate those as they come, right? There's been a routinization of publicization or publicizing of the naval transits to the Taiwan Strait. Now, I think any one of us who follow Taiwan, and I imagine all of us do, to a great degree, follow follow Taiwan news quite closely. You will certainly have noticed in the past 4 years that there has been a very regular uptick in publicization of U.S. naval transits through the Taiwan Strait. Now, that's not to say that those transits haven't happened in the past. But there was a conscious decision on the part of the U.S. administration to publicize those transits now. I personally have been supportive of those publicization. I know that many people say, well, why do we need to publicize those? I mean, Beijing knows that we're doing that, but I don't think that that's enough. I think that people need to know that we're doing that, and that is important, because that shows that even though the United States may be expressing its support, indirectly by not publicizing these naval transits. By doing so, I think it has a very important effect because it counters directly the type of propaganda effects that China is engaging in terms of military activities vis-a-vis Taiwan in the Taiwan Strait. So these regularization and the routinization of these naval transits have been, I think, key. The resumption of cabinet level visits and interactions by senior officials of the U.S. national security, including the U.S. National Security Advisor. Some of you may recall National Security Advisor John Bolton had also met with Taiwan's National Security Advisor as well. There's been the signing of several landmark Taiwan-related bills pushed through by Congress. We can go into a long discussion about the role of Congress, and I think there's a really interesting discussion to be had there because I think the Congress has been unprecedentedly active over the last 4 years and really in laying out a long-term foundation for the development of the U.S. Taiwan policy, like through the Taiwan Travel Act or the Taipei Act or the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, or most recently the Taiwan Reassurance Act. These are all key. They're not just sort of talk pieces. They're not just sort of there to sort of thump our chest or anything like that. They actually have meaningful legislative dictates there that would require the executive branch to do things, and we can talk about that. There were several declassification of internal policy documents with regards to Taiwan policy that were critical. For those of us who study Taiwan policy, we know those because we read the congressional reports, right? But it's not publicly accessible for a very long time. There were footnotes in congressional studies report, but they were never publicized in its original form. And to the administration's credit, they declassified those, and now they are in the public bloodstream. These include memos by President Reagan that clarified U.S. commitments to Taiwan, even during when there were the signing of the third communique, 1982 communique. And I stated that early on in terms of really the normalization of ties with the PRC is conditioned absolutely on the PRC's commitment to a peaceful resolution. And so, that leaves open a great deal of, sort of negotiating room about where U.S. policy should go with regards to finding a new equilibrium in this new environment. There's certainly been high level and public support for Taiwan's international participation. Certainly under the WHO for WHO, and needless to say, I think for everyone here, I mean, Taiwan has just been exemplary with regards to its handling of the coronavirus, much to this, I think uh, in contrast to the situation that we find ourselves in here, and most of us here in the United States. But I think that has nonetheless highlighted really Taiwan's as a democracy, role, and I think there has been a concerted effort on the part of Washington to really to really try to hoist that up because at the end of the day, I mean, as a democracy, Taiwan has an essential, critical role to play not only for itself but for other democracies as well, right? And this is a clear case in point where we have this contest between authoritarian models and democratic models, and you know what? Taiwan is the one holding up the democratic model and really holding it up for everybody else, and that's key. Um, there's been an elevation of the global cooperation and training framework. Some of you may be familiar with this. This might be a little bit more sort of in the weeds. But since 2015, the United States and Taiwan have been organizing regular training workshops between the United States and Taiwan, and just most recently included Japan as one of the coordinating partners, so formal partners, official partners of this mechanism that is now going to increase workshop capacity building for third-party countries that traditionally can benefit from Taiwan's know-how, but frankly speaking, uh, were coerced or could not, engage Taiwan because they were afraid that basically Beijing would pose this cooperation. And with this framework, which now the U.S. Congress has actually funded quite substantially in the most recent appropriations, I think we're going to see even in the last 4 years, a significant uptick. But I think we're going to see even more so in the years to come because there's just going to be much more resources available to really put into these initiatives, and that's again the global cooperation and training framework. And so, I know that my time is starting to run thin, and I do want to give all of you as much of a comprehensive view as I can provide in terms of what I think where we are right now. Um, is that I think to really say, and just to say that with the last item where what the Trump administration started is the new economic prosperity dialogue. For those of us who have been following U.S.-Taiwan relations for a very long time, we've been advocating, for a U.S.-Taiwan free trade agreement, bilateral trade agreement for, as you know, as as long as it can be. And certainly, I think that's the issue here is certainly on the U.S. side, and in terms of why there hasn't been any forward progress. Um, but part of the reflection in terms of really just wanting to get something started, can be found is in this initiation of this dialogue because, frankly speaking, there's USTR is just has been unwilling, to initiate dialogue on this for a very long time, and it doesn't look like, at least in terms of the current administration now, given its priority in sort of fixing our own house, that there would be any kind of really forward movement. But if we can work around the edges, sort of build a habit of cooperation, through these dialogue mechanism at a senior enough level, perhaps at the very least we can sort of start putting the pieces together for something like a bilateral trade agreement or a free trade agreement. And I think that was the rationale in terms of why state the State Department was the one that initiated this dialogue and not the USTR, right? It was just because I think state probably got a little bit impatient, with USTR and said, you know what, we're just gonna have to move ahead with this dialogue with Taiwan, and USTR you got to catch up with us at some point in the future. So hopefully, at the very least, I mean, even though in my personal view, it seems that a bilateral trade agreement may be a little bit a signing of a bilateral trade agreement may be a little bit far fetched at this point, but that should not preclude the beginning of negotiations for a bilateral trade agreement. And I think that's what we need to push, right? I mean, we need to push for the fact that there should be, at the very least, the resumption of the resumption of dialogue under the TIFA talks, right? The Taiwan Investment Framework Agreement talks, which haven't been happening since 2016. And I think we can at least, push for that. And I think that's where we need to go. So I know I spent most of the bulk of my time here now talking about the Trump administration. And since that we are 30 days into the Biden administration, I do want to give the Biden administration a fair evaluation in terms of where I see them going, where they have been going, and honestly, I do think that in my own objective, personal point of view, they have been I think rather consistent in continuing a lot of the positive momentum initiated under the Trump administration. There's certainly, areas in which the Biden administration disagrees with the Trump administration on policy, but actually, I think that there's been less disagreement on Taiwan than many other areas. So I think the most significant indicator for me, at least, came from Secretary of State Tony Blinken's confirmation hearing that he gave, and there was a question from Senator Mitt Romney, Republican from Utah, former presidential candidate, and his question was, "How does Taiwan and our commitment to Taiwan figure into your thinking with regards to our interest in the region?" And Blinken, and I want to read this out in full because I do think it's important because it does, I think, spell out the breadth of how the Biden administration views Taiwan's role in U.S. policy, foreign policy. Here he says, "There's been a strong and long bipartisan commitment to Taiwan. The Taiwan Relations Act, also the communiques with China. Part of that commitment is making sure that Taiwan has the ability to defend itself against aggression, and that is a commitment that will absolutely endure in a Biden administration. We will make sure Taiwan has the ability to do that. I'd like to also see that Taiwan playing a greater role around the world, including in international organizations, when those organizations don't require the status of the country to be a member. They should become members, and when it does, there are other ways that they can participate. And I think our engagement with Taiwan should be looked at, and indeed, that's being done. As you know, some regulations were promulgated by the outgoing Secretary of State. We're going to take a hard look at those pursuant to the Taiwan Assurance Act, and we will look at that. At the Opportunity Center, when President Tsai was running for office, to actually receive her as a candidate at the State Department when I was last there. I spoke to her a number of times when she became president and I was Secretary of State. But the commitment to Taiwan is something that we hold to very strongly. So therein, I think, what the Secretary of State now has referred to in terms of former Secretary of State Pompeo's lifting of self-imposed restriction are instructive because, as we have seen, at least in practice, in particular by the current administration, with regards to, for instance, the invitation of Taiwan's ambassador to the United States, Shelby Kim, to the inauguration ceremony, and this will be the first time that Taiwan's ambassador had been formally invited and also attended the meeting. That there was quite a significant signal there. Subsequent meetings between by the ambassador and also with the Assistant Secretary of State under the Biden administration, acting Assistant Secretary of State at the State Department, also serves to indicate the continuity of some of these lifting of restrictions. And so there are, I think, really positive signs coming from this administration right now that seems to indicate that this administration would hold fast to many of these developments, and that includes, of course, responses to these provocations that China has engaged. I've exhausted, I'm sure, most of my time here, and I want to give my co-panelists an opportunity to also to share their views. And so, let me conclude here, and again, thanks to Dr. Shi, Jane, and Martin, and all of you for this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing my co-panelists discuss their views, and then also if there are questions at the end, I'm happy to take any of your questions as well. So let me close out there.
多谢哈，罗总哈，伊做无闲的啦吼，啊，都有迄个囡仔细汉囡仔吼，啊，伫这个教无闲来演讲吼，咱真多谢来拍拍者吼。好，即摆吼，迄个第二个演讲者是蔡明宏先生吼。我即摆把这个 presenter 就登来好不好？好，来，我即摆 share screen 吼，伊个 PowerPoint 吼。好，明宏兄，你会使开始讲。
各位咱台湾来的好朋友，嘛有台湾的听众吼。今仔日我要讲的主题是美国借机的大选访问，甲将个美国的大甲咱连线甲这个美国的大选甲全球的安全因为这原来有影响到台湾的安全当然。这个选举拢要相像所以咱就这个话题来了解这个美国的选举甲台湾的选举有啥物无共款的所在。今仔我要讲的重点就是有这10项美国的宪法甲美国未来的大选甲这个美国的这届这个选举的这个风波这个10项，我一条一条来说明 ，OK。因为有10条，所以每一条差不多是3分钟安尼吼。第一条是美国的宪法，加美国的法院，加美国宪法的修正案，咱来探讨一下 ，OK。我即马个叫落来，美国的今仔日选举甲宪法有关系，这若讲到宪法。就讲到美国的独立战争，美国的独立战争是1975年甲1983年，拢总差不多是差不多8年的时间。这个美国的宪法是美国独立了，这所有这政治精英这来讨论讲美国要安怎制定一部真好的宪法来会当讲安尼久久长长来。规范美国的进步甲发展所以呢，伊是独立了这是1978年制定这1989年2年后才生效伊这个宪法的重点甲台湾的宪法完全无共款，所以咱小可来比较甲探讨一下。 这个美国的宪法有五项基本的原则，就是以人民做主。这个人民的主权就是咧控制政府，唔是政府控制人民。第二就是政府由人民来选举。美国的政府受法律的限制。美国的宪法就是决定三权分立。这个因为美国是联邦制，所以有50州，大家联合起来。做一个联合的共和国，所以呢，伊要尊重宪法，要尊重联邦，要尊重各州保证的基本权利的权利就对啦。今仔日咱探讨美国的大选，哪会引起这么多风波？较短迄夜。OK，这个。就是修正案，第一修正案，甲第25、甲27。今仔日咱要讲就是讲25的这个宪法的修正案，因为这是关系美国的正副总统、正副参甲这个行政人员。27条上尾这个修正案是关系。人民有权利的代志，美国绝对分做三权分立，司法、国会法院，立法就是美国的国会，行政就是美国的国务院，所以今日咱要来探讨，过来 next， 即摆卖一啊件。一页跟背起来安尼吼，我哪讲你哪调整这个幅度，我来讲。美国这个过去的大选，美国的民主制度，宪法有规定，讲所有任何争议、政治、社会各方面的争议，就是爱。过议会，经过法院来解决所有的争端。但是呢，若最后议会无法度解决，当然就是爱动手就对。所以伫美国有3个真标，会使讲爱说明的独立战争。头拄讲1775年就开始收台，就是迄阵美国这3州。因为就是不堪英国无理的殖民统治，就对因有要收台以前，因有开一个国州的会议，叫做大陆会议。大陆会议才制定一个叫做独立宣言，宣言啦。所以这就是独立战争要开始的时，就是要有这个议会大家有讲决定要独立战争安尼就对。所以美国独立战争成功，但是咱爱知美国的独立战争，除了美国的百姓甲讲认同这块土地，爱为这块土地独立，但是呢，法国原来有派陆军，嘛有派海军来支援美国的独立战争，所以法国。人民原来死真济人，除了法国以外，西班牙、甲荷兰原来有派志愿兵来参加美国的独立运动。美国的独立了的100年了，美国要庆祝这个独立战争独立100年，所以呢，美国的政府举办一个真盛大的纪念。法国有派代表来。讲伊要喊一个自由女神、自由女神啦吼，所以伫纽约市来甲纽约拢会看到自由女神这身，这就是法国政府赠送予美国的人民一个自由的象征安尼吼。过来，因为这个南北，这个讲了吼 ，OK， 就是南北战争，就是。 经过美国的国会参议长2亿咱北会所提起的定论到尾无法度美国总统林肯就讲无法度所以只好就是讲无就是动手两边会使动手所以呢，南军是二将 Robert Lee， 李将军是西点进校的校长，所以呢，开始烧台是南军先发枪，第一枪是南军先发枪。上头嘛，南军较勇着点，因为 Robert Lee 将军因为伊的学生足济，拢有经验所以就是开始较赢面。但是呢，北方是你军火的生产经济较好所以到尾是北军较赢面。即马2020年，这个美国大选就是甲传统的大选无共款因为科技的发达这个选举机械的发明甲使用当然就有一寡弊端安尼所以呢，即届的美国的大选会使讲是大选的超限战 C4ISR 这恁会当用 Google 去找讲这什么意思？就是指挥啦、通讯啦、这个控制啦、电脑啦，过来就是情报啦、这个侦数甲侦查，佫加一个叫做 RC Remote Control。所以恁即马已经美国的选举对旧年的10月到今仔日5个月可能佫要这个定义要佫偌久毋知。即马佫加一个 RC Remote Control， 咱会当了解拜登拢伫地下室，无出来甲群众拍招呼演讲，川普就无共款所以呢，伊拢是地下室去做总指挥，就是你操作这超限战这内容这物件所以讲起来，这是美国选举无共，即届无共款的所在。OK，next， 这个有关免一条一条啦，我讲揪起来 ，OK， 过来，揪开就来，过来。即马美国的大选是有两个政党，美国是政党政治，是民主党甲共和党即届选举呢有真无共款，差不多有50个。这个政治人士参加这个争分的争端就对啦。第三，叫过第三一个第三回后刚才第三不让第三是啥？第三，我叫较悬。
无
第三第三。
伊就是安尼。
他多我有看到，OK， 我给你。
13那个
这个OK， 佫看内容，有内容无？
这个内容。
内容 OK。即马这个选举报纸媒体甲川普甲其他人你评论拢讲出这些专有名词咱小可甲看卖者，离席沼泽什么叫做金主？你控制全球的主义索罗斯甲一寡黑面鬼甲安提法、深层政府、民主政府、建制派、主流媒体、代数法院、绥靖主义、法西斯主义、大通过、全球主义。即马上较重要就是讲这个深层政府甲是离席沼泽，这两项差不多会使讲共这个民主政府真严重。我即马咱就说明，什么叫做深层政府呢？ 这是共党的执政党也好，在野党也好，就是讲因有把持因古年来的这个政经的关系甲人事夹连起来。这次深层政府拢是民进党的人，因为民主党呢对这个规个前总统甲伊的内阁甲一寡政治人物，毕竟拢有利益共生的关系。啊，川普才做4年，啊，伊是生理人，过去也毋捌参政，啊，所以呢，伊即几项伊拢哦 ，OK， 好，啊，咱即马个研究落来。啊，台湾有深层政府无？有，日本有无？有，哦，啊，我记一个咧，第二世界大战就是关东军影响日本的政治。日本的军国主义，东条英机这派，伊就控制日本的政治的决定，包括这个禁卫军，就是会使讲等于深层政府。啊，若讲到台湾呢，真侪人讲啊，新潮流啦、小鹰派啦，这拢是深层政府的一部分。OK， 啊，所以你会当甲想讲，啊，美国的深层政府是什么款？就是大部分。就是民主党的人，甲民主党的官员，包括一寡共和党的官员，甲一寡有影响的人。咱即摆来看这届大选，有真侪人讲是大选的政变。啊，政变是啥？就是政治利益共生的群体，甲一寡人，差不多50个人啊做伙。来去，互即个选举闹到乌沙沙呢。我即摆小讲者，即个众议院呢有435票，435的即个议员就对。啊，这个人数，加州上届济53席，啊上届少一个人，啊所以拢总435。啊，这个民主党是222，共和党211，啊，佫加一个缺席2位，啊，所以这个合起来，第二，美国的选举毋是用人民的票数，是用选举人的选举人票，拢总是民主党232票，啊，共和党306票，啊，这变做这个，拢总合起来是538票。啊，你若是要过这个选举人票，就是爱270票，才会当选啊。OK， 但是即马这个选举了后，啊，到要发表的进程，有6州摇摆州啊。有争议啦，有咧修告，有咧起诉，啊起诉要去对，就是去法院安尼吼。啊，头拄我有讲到法院，小甲了讲，直接补充一下。美国个法院分做联邦法院，啊有13个巡回法院，地方差不多40几位，就是讲每一州拢有一个啦，啊那巡回就是一个州啊，佮附近几州合起来咧巡回法院。啊，上届结尾上届最高法院就是伫理事，敢若一个尔。OK， 啊，即个即摆因为即个选举有问题，所以咧共和党提出起诉，向法院起诉。啊，拢总有6个摇摆州，啊，即个票数拢是参加0.几加1几就对了，啊，所以呢，这个少子啊16票，宾州20票，阿里佐纳11票，威斯康星票，密西根16票，内华达6票，合起来有79票，叫做摇摆州的选举人票，啊，这有争议，啊，共和党川普还有。川普的律师向这几个摇摆州提出告诉，啊，但是呢，告诉 袂当讲真紧就表决所以即摆我讲起来，遮拢讲79票，这个选举人票，这个民主党是306票，共和党是232票，这点就是合起来538票，就是爱超过半数，就是270票。所以呢，这个川普是232，若个找到79票的半数，伊就过半数270就赢。这个70，即马这几州，结果拢是民主党赢。但是民主党有真侪弊端，拢有证据，拢去法院去告，但是无遐尼早判。判是当时判呢，是伫1月初几个1月初10宣布，1月初10宣布迄天，这个调查到我说明。这个众议院议长是经过多数的党的众议员较侪迄个动作，迄个众院的议长，但是长是美国在任的副总统来做议长，所以这个那个。迄个彭斯是安那到即马，互感觉讲伊违反，因为头拄我讲诶，彭斯即个6州还未决定诶时，就是这个共和党306票，爱减去79票，因为这6州拢是民主党赢。是安尼赢，因为怀疑讲是选举机械甲人为的操作所以引起这6州拢是民主党赢所以呢，法院控告应该，所以就是彭斯伊应该讲，无这6州暂时卖算看这两党搭一个选举人票较济，就做总统。当然啦，这拢偏见啦。就这个6州经过法院的调查甲审判，当然爱经过辩论啦，甲审查。所以这个彭斯无尽到伊做议长的义务，违反宪法。所以呢，甚至伊嘛。应该徛伫共和党的立场，伊应该讲这个共和党，这个232，假使讲伫这个79票，摕一半38票，就是232加38票，就270票，就变做大多数当选，川普就继续连任安尼。所以呢，即届会引起这就是选举机械。甲这个地方法院，甲这州长选举这人员有瑕疵，有争议啦，所以这我就讲较固定。所以呢，这个到尾2月13投票，本来顶回一摆是56票。44票，但是即天搁加一个共和党的议员跳票走票就对，所以变做43比57，但是要达到67票的同意票，无通过，无过这个67票，差几票？差10票。所以这个投票的时呢，这个共和党，这个叫做啥？叫做这个。赵小兰银行叫做迄个，伊无出来投票，伊知影讲，所以伊就无投票。 但是投票了，伊说攻击川普应该要受法院的制裁安尼，所以讲起来，特别共和党的人，原来发生走票几个，众议院有10票，10个人，共和党参议院有走7票，17个，包括真侪人无表态，但是真明显无挺川普，无挺共和党的立场嘛，袂少人，所以合起来差不多是有25个。我毋是讲议员啦，包括政治人物。OK， 所以即马咱来个看一下。即马就是讲了解美国的选举，要安怎互台湾的选举制度会较好？台湾的宪法爱安怎制定？即届因为美国有即款，所以呢，这2天报纸就看讲美国的宪法爱改革，即个呢，啥物人提出呢？是美国的选举的金主叫做所罗门提出来，还是伊先提出来？伊即个人是足好个啊，差不多200-300亿有啦，伊拢有奉献政治现金互共和党，但是呢，伊已经90岁啊，但是伊现在要真关心美国的政治，因为美国的宪法无改完整，因为即届选举的产生就是宪法制定了无相信。OK， 即摆过来就是讲，这支持川普这人士，就是这个人这个人，这个拢放伫台湾海外网，恁会当名放入去Google去了解因。其中我一个特别爱讲，就是讲一个 Peter Navarro， 伊出两本册真出名，叫做《致命中国》，就是《Dead by China》，另外一本是 Closing Tiger， 就是恶虎啦，迄个比较好倒落迄款英文名，叫做恶虎长龙，迄个恶虎。OK， 过来就是深层政府，拢是。主流媒体，恁会当发现讲，哎呀，偏偏共和党哪会无挺共和党？这美国媒体、报纸也好，电视公司也好，拢无挺。这高科技的公司，会使讲是拢是主流媒体的迄个，就讲 Google 啦、Twitter 啦、Facebook 啦，真济，是安那拢是反川普，讲起来就是为着利益。为着这个人的权限，所以美国的选举呢，无以国家做优先，以国家做利益的原则。甲台湾同款，以政党第一，政策第二，国家人民放伫头尾啊呢。所以即届美国的选举，会使讲美国的价值就讲有损害啊。这个投票机械，我来小个说明一下。这个选举机械是为咱瑞达遐开始用，迄个总统选着，但就伊这选举作业系统，伊连续继续做总统，但是呢，因为本身的能力，伊本身。政党的利益、个人的野心，内内做啦，也壁橱愈来愈歹，各方面拢乱糟糟。最近这个缅甸嘛有可能为了选举来咧发生。台湾咱嘛毋知，但是照这间公司，全各个的政府拢有买这个机械，当然。有这个软体操作的方法，但是照这900州差不多10年，像0至2%，就是他讲的6大州， 这个就是更严重的选举的测试啦、弊端会产生安尼。OK， 即马过落来，即马过落来，就卡落来。OK， 即马小可讲即个美国争议，甲今仔日还未过，还未花，哦，啊，搁又去这个，搁第五好吧，第五。OK， 这个川普选举拢有一个政策策略啦，哦，川普的策略就是发动战，这个听证会战，甲动员战，所以川普伊大场面呢，10万、20万、50万的群众运动，川普做了最成功。但是伊原来有准备的战法，就是网络情报战，这项伊有做，但是上届尾啊2项伊无做，就是伊会当运用南北战争这个法令，甲2018年紧急行政命令，这个戒严令甲军事这个，所以这个拜登就是运用这 ，OK， 这个我小可说明一下，这个川普就是用左派专力来你围攻普，逼攻就对了，用暴力政权，是啥？这乌黑的势力的暴力。科技的暴力、行政暴力、司法的暴力、媒体的暴力、经济的暴力，拢总有这6个暴力，是川普因提出讲，这个民主党用这个6项无正规、无合法的暴力安尼，这个引起选举的大风波，民主党。就是用李老虎的利益共生的团体，就是深层政府，就是李希周家，伊联合多派媒体、大型科技的企业，生理人大金主，2个大金主就是这个 George Soros 吼，甲一个就是。KOCH Brother 的大户秘境，所以这其中另外一个叫做 KOCH 这个家族，伊有栽培，伊有派人伫这个川普的身躯边做幕僚，伊叫做 Mark 这个。小，一个是这个大金主靠一个家族，甲应付、甲赞助，伊就是咧反川普，所以呢，这届这个人就是这个彭斯这个辅导长的抓着，所以呢，这届。彭斯伫1月初6，1月初6，伊咧主持参议院的议长，伊说无根据宪法的第25修正案的权利去执行宪法的问题，头仔已经说明去，所以呢，伊这步棋就是无政治智慧，包括第7个。这个参议院中和党的议员嘛背过，伊就是讲无政治智慧，也是讲去用煽动去，去用买手去， 咱唔知吼。OK， 过来。所以这美国全世界的选举，拢为着钱。人若无自私，天诛地灭。但是这款的为着国家应该这款代志袂使做。OK， 今仔过来，国会动乱。就是讲，头早已经讲过啊，这个1月初6的真相，以及甲台湾的高雄事件，甲太阳花事件，甲这个大陆的6.4，这拢真相像。台湾的高雄事件嘛是国民党挑工派人去栽赃，叫一寡黑社会人去拍警察，无赖讲这就是民进党的暴民，所以掠所有的这个民进党的这个精英，即届嘛同款，因1月初6了，就大家就讲叫川普爱受负责责任，实在讲这拢是安迪法，甲这个黑面鬼的人去进攻这个国会，实在讲诶，川普迄早的演讲嘛，讲叫和平。川普演讲还未煞，国会就已经闹到足严重诶，所以讲起来，毋是讲这人听着川普的演讲才去闹国会，毋是吼。这个真相，1月20，嘛是同款。1月20，这个就是这个这个就职典礼这个这物件坦克案嘛是同款。坦克案了的时，讲要叫政来主台讲真相。共和党到尾讲好，你若要按提证人，我提301个。第一个就是副总统，第二个就这个Pelosi，这个啥，那个什么咯 ？OK， 不应该是想起 OK， 这拢是有用过民主党是个有这个党魁，就是这个人这个人是众议的这个叫做这个民主党这个，然后这大家小看者。我即摆是干那讲民主党这个家族啦。这个家族，共和党的司法部长嘛无处理，FBI 嘛无处理 ，CIA 嘛无处理，所以种种呢，这款对这有可能的弊案，中国的弊案，拢是因家族引起的，但是拢无去调查，所以即届的总统选啊，这个后续这样有争议呢，拢是安尼所以就讲这个要叫这个副总统去作证Pelosi 啦，Pelosi 要去作证，所以民主党听着讲，共和党要第一个证人是要叫这个来做，要这两个来作证，民主党就丢弃，投票无过安尼OK， 今仔过落来，今仔要1分钟啦，我讲较紧 OK。弗兰克今仔佫讲起较落来，来弗兰克好啦。咱即摆来看，这就职离的仪式甲民情有啥物款呢？拜登就职，伫国会1,000个人当然去看伊的线上的消息，达到3万几个。但是川普呢，去空军基地遐做一个离任的演说，了坐飞机等于佛罗里达因迄个庄头规条路拢是热烈的人民来你甲欢迎。 所以呢，就一点点去讲，川普甲拜登的这个民情啦，线上的迄个就是35000至差不多300万，所以相差100倍。啊，最近的这个情人节就是美国的总统节，佛罗里达川普嘛佫伫遐甲民众伫遐咧游行，啊，伫咧聚会，啊，所以呢，迄个比率嘛1比10，啊，所以呢，看起来是这个美国总统虽然落台，但是较受美国人民这个学乐甲拥戴着。OK， 这么过落来，咱即马看美国的大选的变迁，啊，美国的民主政治，咱对台湾来，佮感觉讲美国的选举应该是足公正的，足有公义的，啊，拢照步来。但是即次会使讲等于啊，比台湾佫较无制度，佫较无站安尼，哦。啊，所以呢，这是美国的价值，美国入国的精神啊，有受到损失。啊，不然严重就是这个选举机械Dominion啊，甲 Smartmatic 这个两间公司呢，所推出的选举机械，甲伊培养的软体会当软操作软体。影响选举的这个制度受人为的影响，啊，所以呢，美国川普的政府伊的电信局这个老人啊，拢封闭收去，啊，美国民主党的州长员嘛有差，啊，所以这就是美国即摆。摇摆州会发生争议的问题。最近有3州法院伫要宣判，就是讲这个是打一边赢也输，这个是影响迄州的选举人票。所以这个若是讲，这佫反倒转来，互川普的是，然后超过38票，哇，安尼面子。共和党变做当选总统，等于川普还佫转来做总统，啊，所以这是美国的一个选举制度无成熟啊，有瑕疵的所在，哦，因为即马法院若判讲啊，有影真正有诈票，有窃票，啊有欺骗，啊有安尼是，啊，所以这就是爱一面倒，哦，啊，所以即届。本来参议院这个川普，伊是讲伊会超过50票的52票，包括最近选举的Georgia的2票，应该是压属于共和党爱赢，但是到尾啊嘛是民主党赢去，啊嘛是同款，嘛有真侪人怀疑讲是选举机械作弊的。OK。啊，美国上界可贵就是司法、行政、立法三权分立，啊，但是这个要渐渐哪像甲台湾同款，台湾是5权分立，但是嘛是同款，互执政党来去全盘控制，什么人做执政党，什么人控制五院的所有的运作安尼，所以是。啊，剩3分钟了吼，这个好啦，啊，这个啊，就是讲这个选举呢，感觉讲人性本恶啦，人性本善的美国过去的传统过去，美国的左派抬头啦，美国的教育制度。拢去互遮个左派思想的老师啊去受到影响。啊，川普伊就是有绥靖的思维，啊，这美国那强啊，所以中国就马上 出手去摕缅甸啊，报纸讲听讲新加坡就是伊第二个要摕所在，伊就是要控制缅甸甲新加坡将这个南海甲亚太，伊全部会当控制。所以呢，这当讲川普呢做总统，所以无川普的坚强甲意志啊咧。OK， 过来第10条。讲9条拢是讲美国的，当然上尾7条，迄个2000年美国大选，咱换来小咱来探讨台湾2020年的选举。台湾嘛有经过初选，但初选嘛是照步来，但是伊的操作、伊的运作、伊的控制。甲伊的超限战嘛，甲美国共款啦，用威吓啦，用啥，用利益啦，用这些步数全部拢用啦。所以你讲科技、经济各面拢真好，但是独这个选举制度败坏，选举文化恶质，所以这是咱真可惜的所在。OK， 民调嘛共款。民调就是讲，有知识的人5间民调公司就接受民进党提出来的名单，这个名单是民进党过去几摆民调的物件放入去大台电脑，分互5间，互因家己去用。当然，条件嘛是拢过去用互某人为主嘛，所以讲起来。台湾的选举制度一定要改革，这就是因为无改革呢，台湾永久是咧扑咧。这个台湾最近的选举罢免嘛引起一个流行，即马国民党为着要提悬伊的气势，提着伊的气势。所以呢，我时间到，我用上尾1分钟。所以即摆就是讲，台湾这个选罢法，台湾的宪法，因为选举就是我们根据这个宪法来，台湾的宪法若无改，无以台湾这个国家人民最优先的事，美国是用美国，现在川普这么受欢迎，因为以美国。优先美国不等于再伟大，美国所有的工厂拢做迄个，所以这是以美国为最悬，以国家为主。咱即马台湾就好，大家这政客拢政党政客本身的利益，所以台湾的这个选举制度应该就要回归以台湾人民做上最悬的关键安尼。我有迄个好意。请大家看安尼来可能就小互大家看者。所以呢，这个10条，请大家看者。今仔日真多谢咱这个美国的选举来探讨台湾的这个选举制度，和台湾的政治的运作要安怎创，尤其是台湾的宪法若无改，台湾的公道的制度若无改，台湾要进步偌济。我相信是真方怀疑安尼。真多谢各位来收看，多谢感谢。
真感谢蔡明通先生，伊准备遮丰富的资料可惜时间稍短无法度互伊发挥以后看有机会发挥好好讲者。咱即摆就接的请黄清燕律师我即摆就放伊的 slide 请 Jane 你就mute 你的麦克你会使开始讲演讲好 ，Jane， 你开始讲。Jane，你有听到无？
真多谢笔会会长遮尔用心办这个活动，今仔多谢你的帮忙吼，多谢。
Jen，Jen，你无法度开你的麦克吗？
OK，就 OK 啦。
OK
好，好，即摆有听到啊，好，
有听到了 OK。
好，安尼我再等你。
因为时间的关系吼，我讲较短者吼，我即摆讲吼，主要吼，我要讲寡，因为我这个人，咱啊第一个我知影讲，咱家己认为咱一煞人，吼，我是真乐观的人，我真拍拼，我是互人吼，会信用你的人吼，我希望啥物？我今仔来美国吼，我希望吼，对美国对这个台湾，就是算做Indo-Pacific 这个 area 吼，会和平、安全、繁荣、人权，吼有所贡献。我认为就拍拼啦吼。即马过过就是讲，我的查某祖公呢是平埔族吼，即栋的大客坎迄个位的，甲我的查甫祖公即个漳州来，所以阮才有黄家的厝啦吼。我即马伫讲是讲，我希望这内底吼有几项代志，就是讲，咱会当学过去的经验啦吼。我过去的经验就是讲，我可能跟着有7天，跟着有7天。我即摆伫讲有一个 basic 嘅3个问题，我问就是当时嘅 policy maker，都无认为政策嘅人，无你想做这个政策，无你想讲，你这个政策是第一，我伫问就讲吼，是毋是台湾人少年人会使讲吼，安那样去做田，搁去读册？你是读册，哪有可能做田？这跟着有7天，所以跟着有7天，毋是跟着特别当有田。这个政策，这个因拢无想这个政策，伊有想讲，这个政策的人吼，看嘛是毋是会使去读册？就是你就袂用读册，读册就无做田无做田，你就袂使有田有土地。第3就是讲，你是毋是会使互因读册吼？读甲讲高中还是大学出了吼，才决定伊要做田，伊要当做田咯。迄当然才关，像我的情形哦。跟着有7天开始，我小学5年级，我到大学2年的时都无去啊啦吼。所以这个中间因做这代志拢无考虑，几项差到我讲迄无啦吼。即马过就是讲，我希望吼，我这样是美国，我来美国已经50多年啦吼。我希望吼，台湾我较乐观，所以我认为台湾甲美国吼，这个关系会慢慢真小心有哪做，会往 positive side 哦，较正面的方向发展啦吼，这个上重要一个就是讲，咱是以国家的利益做基础，因为我过40年来，美国甲中国的这外交政策完全是私人的利益这款代志互专家的人去讲，我不爱去讲这代志啦吼。我希望台湾甲美国的这将来关系是基础是看咧咱的目标、咱的 objective、咱的目的、咱的。是为着国家的利益，这就要去讲国家的利益是啥物咯？这个国家各个，你这个个 page 各个迄个 page， 那 next page， 国家的利益吼，我认为吼，这可能都爱policy maker爱先讲哦。当然我较理想派吼，台湾美国甲中国的迄个 policy 吼，我较正常，我相信迄毋是 national interest， 因是 based on private interest。甲即马为讲吼，像出人讲什么沼泽啦，啥物吼，遐40年了吼，脱袂开。第2就是讲吼，我认为吼上较好，因为我读教育就是讲台湾的即个 manpower training 吼，爱想讲社会需要是啥物吼，有4年还是几年adjust 这边，袂讲话出来吼，你若无伊食饭无论做啥物嘛食饭总是有办法摕到伊的一个业务啦，吼。这个呢，这就是干涉到啥物话，就是讲吼，我理想派是认为吼，台湾甲美国若会当 create job for each other， 我感觉这是上怪好的一个乐观的一个 policy 啦。我相信这有可能发生，可能是技术界，可能是某一个会啊，大家互相开一家或一家的，安尼时阵特别讲说台湾啊，你讲为讲台湾的 mix up with Thailand， 可能都分不清楚啊，所以咱原来爱交朋友啊，即马台湾就是讲钱可能无真济啦啊，所以咱这个manpower training啊，甲 education 咱都要真注意有一段时间咱拢是人做无一定真好，但是管是4年一遍，还是几年一遍啊，做一个调整，看社会需要啥物，尤其是公立学校，你用公家的税，你创啊这学校制作出来学生，拢袂当做头路啊！到底是公立大学，这公立学校是啥物公立学校？然后，这第二就是讲这个我认为上要紧的就是讲，将来定政这些人 policy maker 啦这个 policy maker 伊就好好啊想，你家己是啥物人？啊，你将来要定这个 national interest 是啥物货？啊，这美国国家利益，我想偷偷老实讲袂少。啊，台湾家己知影家己利益是啥物啊？大家拢爱和平啊，当然是和平共存是上快好啊。啊，若无的时阵是要怎样？为着你家己安全，为着这个和平因爱做啥物？这因都要好好啊想啦。啊，这资源因有好咯啊，若讲像较老的已经退休可能伊若叫你做你钱等了较少，还是讲你车费费就好安尼啦好少年的，可能少年的较需要钱嘛啊，这是我个人的希望啦，还是我的suggestion啊，因为我是真乐观啊，所以我可能讲的可能较理想派啦啊，即马已经伫10点嘛我毋才剩2分钟啊，我讲就是讲，咱这笔会笔啦更是古早一个相名伫台北话叫做李铁笔，伊甲阮老母讲，我搭一年生，搭一个月生，搭一日生，搭一时生。伊讲我是足好命，足好命，袂使分人，所以我无互分人。阮老母无甲我分人，佮甲我栽培，佮甲我饲，佮我出个大汉。啊，咱秘鲁的人一定是真关心美国，佮关心台湾，互美国会强起来，啊，互咱来要栽培台湾啊，互将来因这两个政府、两个国家拢会什么上帝保佑，我后壁还有一个天佑台湾就讲上帝保伊安尼啦啊，阮即摆都10点嘛，我想都无搁用时间啦啊，我是讲用我个人的经验讲一个跟着有7天啊，你读册免那跟着，免那跟点啊，你都无产。所以迄当阵我认为，迄当阵来定迄个目的，就是要专为外包台湾人中产阶级的 financial support。啊，所以阮毕业了，食土都袂记，啥物人会搁去插政治，去争政权。啊，我读北一的时，我有同学妈妈甲我讲啦，伊讲因拢无产，因来甲美国因甲台湾因所有的产地拢无去。啊，我客气我甲讲，你若在中国大陆是跟着有起点，可能中国共产党都爬起来。搁一个，恁无产，但是恁有头路，恁的薪水真悬，阮无啊。所以这都是讲为着啥人，为着某一群人，啊，也是讲大多数的人，啊，我希望将来是为着大多数的人做。多谢多谢恁的时间，我才讲较无10分钟嘿。
多谢Jane咱小弟伊的对台美关的期望啊啊，伊看一个台美人看有法度做到啥物款咱今仔日真欢喜3个演讲者来演讲咱即是Q&A 啦我看遮有迄个chat 个先有即个李宏基教授伊有问题李教授你家己讲好无
有人对我有问题，我就答。
你当按麦克mute 你麦克呗
Hey, yeah, 我用台湾话讲不要紧啦May I ask you, in Taiwanese or should I speak it in English?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Okay, I'm asking Russell.
Oh, Russell, just English. I'm good.
If you can ask in English, that'd that'd be perfect.
乱手跟我有一样啦。
Okay, all right. My question is that your analysis is excellent. I like it very much, and I'm a historian, so I usually talk about what has happened, what has been happening, and so I like it very much. But in your opinion, would you venture a guess on what would be the best policy for Taiwan now? This is and then of course you have you're a director of this organization in DC, and what are the most important sort of works that you are focusing in?
Excellent questions. So allow me to take the second one first.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what areas that we like to focus on, I think the focus should always be on what tangible areas of cooperation can we promote between the United States and Taiwan that can further enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan in areas of politics, economics, security, that can help to enhance the mutual security of the both sides. So, rather than focus on perhaps what many of us would normally want to look at, because we are generally, I think, much more, and many of us, I suppose, focus on how and how Taiwan should be treated in such ways. There are a lot of ways in which we can work around the margins of cooperation where I feel like we haven't been utilizing enough and focused on enough that can work towards having a more normal relationship between the United States and Taiwan, rather than actively pushing for a full normalization, right? So my point here is, look, I essentially, I think the United States and Taiwan is moving towards a more normal relationship. We should be pushing for a more normal relationship between the United States and Taiwan. And the way that we do that is that we interact with Taiwan and with Taipei and Washington in a more normal fashion in all areas of interaction. Obviously, there are going to be limitations in various forms and various ways, but I think we can do that in various fashions to deal with to do so in our work. So, with regards to your first question, and remind me again, what's the first question?
Well, what do you think that it may happen between China and Taiwan, or to Taiwan? What would be the best scenario that may happen?
Yeah. That's a good. That's a difficult one. Right. I mean, honestly, that's a pay grade. That's a pay grade above what above mine, right? So that is obviously a decision for the president of Taiwan to make in terms of what decisions and what choices to make to best, secure the interest of Taiwan. But I do believe that we are entering a precarious period. Tensions between Taiwan and China are rising. China is escalating its military provocations against Taiwan. This will necessitate stronger reactions on the part of the United States, and I think we expect to see that from the U.S. in the absence of any substantial changes of policy on the part of Taipei. And I think there's a clear understanding here in Washington, at least, that these pressure campaign that China is engaging against Taiwan has to be answered in kind, and perhaps in some ways to elevate Taiwan's international space in order to ensure that it does not continue to be coerced by Beijing. So that setting as the context, I think the best course of action for Taipei, in my personal view, is to stay the course, right? Stay the course. Maintain a stable and predictable environment, close consultation with allies and partners, obviously with the United States and Japan and other partners. I do believe that fact that the United States should engage more with other like-minded allies in the region to garner more support for Taiwan. I don't think this is an issue area where the United States alone can fully dictate the outcome. Certainly, a role for Japan will be necessary, and I do. My sense is, at least on the Japan side, there are movements there that are quite interesting. And we can get into that in a different conversation, but the fact that they are discussing their own version of a Taiwan Relations Act is quite substantial. It's not, I mean, the only country in the world that has a Taiwan Relations Act is the United States, and Japan discusses the process of that. And if there were to be a U.S. intervention in the event of a military conflict over Taiwan, the U.S. bases in Japan would absolutely be involved. And so, so there has to be a role there, the part of Japan. So we need to have those discussions. I mean, I think the United States, Japan, and Taiwan needs to have those discussions, and I think that's where we need to really start, really talking, both on a track 2 level, meaning on the expert level, but also at a governmental level. And my sense is that there are some inkling of a discussion about that, but we need to push harder. So in a way, I'm punting on your question to say, that I don't necessarily have the answer for you on what we need to do. But at the very end, as a matter of a role of a think tank, we want to facilitate as many discussions as possible to make sure that the ideas are put forward and that we can discuss them in a meaningful and concrete and hopefully actionable manner to help pursue some course of policy-oriented actions. So I hope I addressed those questions in some way for.
Okay, thank you. I believe Dr. Peter Ho, you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Shi. And this also for Russell is to follow up with your kind of alluding to what has Taiwan in terms of status engaging other democratic countries?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I mean, I think that's an area that needs to be further explored. Frankly speaking, though, I mean, there's little that Taiwan itself can really do without the support of other democratic allies to really enhance its cooperation with other democracies. I mean, I think in the Indo-Pacific region itself, really the key players are going to be Japan, Australia, and India, right? And here, I think Japan is probably the most promising, but Japan is very much a function of U.S. policy also as well. How Japan orients itself in the region follows very much in terms of what U.S. policies are. And so, looking in terms of how Taiwan can cooperate, enhance its relations with democracies in the region, I think it's going to be dependent upon, in part, on how Taiwan is able to cooperate with members of the Quad, essentially the Quad, right? So Quad with a quadrilateral relationship, which means Australia, the United States, India, and Japan. And through that, I think Taiwan can really help to enhance its role in playing a critical position in promoting democracies and human rights the Indo-Pacific region. By itself, there are limited tools available for Taiwan to engage in. That's largely because official relations are limited, right? That's just a fact of reality for Taipei. And so leverage there are limited when there are limited official relations. But in a collective and multilateral environment, Taiwan's leverage is significantly enhanced. And when Taiwan's example is held up by other countries like the United States or Japan or others as a model, that goes a long way in showing in exemplifying that. So I think we need to create more opportunities for those types of interactions. Obviously, PRC is going to oppose and find as many means as possible to stifle Taiwan's international space. We've seen that in various forms. I think most visibly, the removal of Taiwan in any of the airlines destination, right? Case in point. But these types of more visible manifestations of PRC's pressure are also creating a backlash, and that's also counterproductive. So how this plays out in the end is going to be we're going to have to observe very closely. But I think in working with other democracies, we have to work collectively and multilaterally, and in that sense, I do think that the Biden administration's apparent focus on a summit of democracies is a very, very good direction, in particular for Taiwan as well. And there's no doubt in my mind that we need to push, wholeheartedly for Taiwan's inclusion in that mechanism. And I think that's going to be an important mechanism going forward, at least under this administration, to really try to pursue some type of multilateral policy that's going to really, I think, in a way, not only benefit Taiwan but benefit democracies in the region worldwide. Yeah.
But the follow-up question I have is, in the United States, just being in Boston, being anywhere. You ask a person on the street and ask, like, do they know Taiwan? People oftentimes don't. So my question is that to let the world know about Taiwan, what are some of the strategies and processes that maybe even GTI is doing or other organizations are trying to do to really do that? I think that's really the importance of promoting our Taiwan's democracy is first, the world needs to know where Taiwan is.
Absolutely. That's a critical question, and I think that's an essential one. And so I can't speak for other organizations, but I can speak for GTI in the sense that what we try to do is we are a very high frequency organization. And that means we produce a lot of content, and we produce content in a very frequent fashion. That's why our programs are oriented. We have biweekly publications. We have almost monthly public seminars, and in some ways, if you think of us as if you think of like the policy community as a band, I think you can think of GTI in a way almost like the drummer. You keep the beat going, right? Keep the beat, and keep the focus on Taiwan, right? You keep people talking about Taiwan, and that is something that was missing, at the very least, in the ecosystem of our broader policy community. And GTI does that, right? With our publications, with our public seminars, with our other programs, and that's how I think we play a role in trying to raise the profile of Taiwan through our programs and through our through our publications and through our events. And I encourage and I encourage other organizations to do the same thing. I mean, it's the fact of the matter is that there are not enough organizations doing our work, because at the end of the day there are just a host of other organizations and issues that take up the airwaves, and we do our best to try to fill those airwaves with issues related to with Taiwan, and we'll continue to do that as long as GTI exists. So.
好，多谢。都有其他有啥物问题无？
Frank， 我会使问一个简单的问题无？
出来意思哈，你讲。
Frank, I enjoy your talk very much. I have a question. If a tough talk does not follow with action, it is worthless. As you can see in Clinton and Obama, they all have a tough talk in the beginning of their presidency. I give you two examples very quick. One is in WHO, that they have continued to against what is the right, what is the truth of the current situation. Number two is in Myanmar. Myanmar, they have a military coup, and all we have is a tough talk, and doesn't seem that we have any action follow the WHO and Myanmar. So I'm fearful that very soon Taiwan will be alone, away from the Biden's main focus. So do you feel my sense of fear in Bay Way?
I presume that question may be for me. So with consideration of my other panelists, I'll take a stab at it first, and leave it open for the others to address the question if they so choose. I do think that there are reasonable concerns to have about whether or not the strategic importance of Taiwan could be decreased in a different grand strategy of the United States that isn't focused on the Indo-Pacific. But my belief and my assessment of the early signs, at least of this administration, has been that the focus is still going to remain on the Indo-Pacific. And in addition to the focus being on Indo-Pacific, the strategy will be focused on promoting U.S. relations with its allies and partners. And it is within that context, I do believe the fact that that Taiwan's role will remain important and central to U.S. policy options towards the Indo-Pacific region. So which is to say that I am not as concerned that somehow Taiwan would be somehow lost in the consideration of U.S. policy options, U.S. policy interests in the Indo-Pacific region under the Biden administration. Again, it's a little bit too early to tell what the comprehensive policy is at this point, but at least my sense of the early indicators in terms of how the administration views Taiwan are, in my view at least, generally somewhat positive. And I point to, again, the statements made by Secretary Blinken during his nomination process, to include the statements made by the Secretary of State's spokesperson with regards to the military provocations, the continuation of the naval transits through the Taiwan Strait at first under the Biden administration, but time will tell, right? I mean, these are not definitive of what will happen, but all these indicators are going to be signs to how we can view the administration's in its how it views Taiwan's role in the broader Indo-Pacific strategy, and that's really the only way to go, in my view. if we have to position Taiwan in the broader strategy, right? Taiwan has to be part of the broader strategy. If we only focus on Taiwan as a matter of a China strategy, it's going to limit Taiwan's applicant role. And there's a lot of things that Taiwan can do to play during the peacetime. It's going to be that we need to emphasize and continue to emphasize because at this point, oftentimes our sort of oxygen is getting sucked up in all these discussions about only, well, what happens when there's a war? And yes, it's important to understand what might happen, but we also have to sort of think about, well, what happened during these times when we're not at war, and how do we enhance the relationship, right? And so, and we need to do that too, right? So, it's a great question. I hope I've addressed at least some parts of your concerns.
Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions?
Yes, I have a question. And
Okay, Dr. Lee. Okay, the end. Okay.
yeah, I sent a message and it looks like nobody is here. Anyway, recently I just wrote a letter to the President Obama about I have a 5 points. One, please look forward. No more revenge. Otherwise endless. Second, reform the voting system to use a paper ballot, hand count, and limit mail-in ballot. Number 3, to continue to investigate Hunter Biden's China Gate. Number 4, to observe the freedom of speech at the press. Number 5, to keep Supreme Court number 2B9. I wrote to the Obama. He wrote me a letter, so I respond to his letter. Any comment from the Luther?
Well, I mean, I think we need to enhance our democracy, right? I mean, I think most importantly, more than anything else, as our role here, our as citizens of the United States, I think all of us who are have an important role to play in ensuring that this democracy works, to advance our interests, and that's important. As far as the other sort of political matters that you've raised with the former president, I think I think that's a political process that will have to be decided by the people in charge. So.
And he asked me the question.
Yeah.
He wrote me a letter, so I wrote back about my feeling.
Yeah.
I have another question. Is I wrote in the written message to the Frank about the current Biden administration. To me, they are try to force Taiwan to accept cease peace condition, and in view of the current movement, like the naval that no longer address Tsai as the Taiwan president. They talk about the people elected leaders. Second is about they are forced one of the Taiwanese friend, I forget his name, Freedom of the Asia, to resign. Even he just on the one month in the post. I forget his name. Okay, so lots of things to me the actions better than matter. See, I consider that, and right now Taiwan is not in good position compared to when Trump in position.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think those are fair concerns, right? I mean, but let me, on the issue of the specific terminology used by the administration, that isn't necessarily a drastic change in policy. It's more of a return to previous ways of referring to the elected representatives of Taiwan. It is a more conservative interpretation of U.S. Policy, but it doesn't necessarily represent a wholesale change in how the United States will approach, or will deal with Taiwan. It's something that we should be, I think, cognizant of and I think aware of, and I applaud you for keeping up with, such use. And I do think that those are useful indicators for us to keep the administration, on check about, how they refer to Taiwan and the people there. Well, especially the elected, the government there. And as far as the placements of the personnel that you have referred to, well, yeah, I think there were individuals who were selected for prominent positions in the previous administration at the very tail end of it, and frankly speaking, I think they were good. I think for Taiwan, but I don't think that they were placed in there for the sake of being pro-Taiwan. I mean, a lot of them, I think at the end of any administration, there's always going to be a change when there's a new administration in power, and so frankly speaking, I think there probably was an expectation for many of those who were selected in those positions that they were probably going to have to be removed, because what happens when there's a new administration in power is that they're going to select new people. So I think that was just an inevitable and an unfortunate situation of what the political transition creates. So I don't know. Maybe it may not be a sort of satisfactory answer for your points, but I hope I do address them in some fashion at least.
Okay, I think it's so late, almost 10:30 evening, and we thank you. We thank Russell for staying so late, and I know he's quite busy. Russell, do you have any related published article? If you have something you'd like to email to me, I can share with the members of Pen Club. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I mean, we constantly have publications, and I'm sure that Jane will know very well what we do, and I'm sure that she'll be more than happy to share them with you. But I can do that as well. We have a bi-weekly publication. We have regular events, and again, I'd be happy to share any and all of our publications with you and the members of your group whenever they are available. So
thank you very much, Russell.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for participation, and all take care. Okay, take care and have a good night. I think we'll conclude tonight's speech. Okay, thank you. Okay, take care.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Hey, Peter, nice